And it's now my privilege to introduce our guest speaker this evening. Dr. Elizabeth Johnson is Distinguished Professor of Theology Emerita at Fordham University, and I can think of no one more ideal for this series on Catholic social teaching. A native of Brooklyn, Dr. Johnson is a member of the Sisters of St. Joseph of Brentwood, Long Island. During the Second Vatican Council, she was a young sister engaged in teaching in Catholic elementary school. The council energized her faith and imagination, and she brought that faith and imagination and energy to her studies, earning a BS from Brentwood College and then an MA in theology from Manhattan College. And in 1981, she became the first woman to earn a Ph.D. in theology from Catholic University in America. In her professional life, Dr. Johnson taught science and religion in Catholic elementary and high schools before teaching theology at the college and university levels, St. Joseph College in Brooklyn, Catholic University of America, and finally at Fordham University, where she had a renowned tenure as professor and scholar for 27 years before her retirement last spring. But she says it doesn't feel like she's retired. But Dr. Johnson's main areas of study focus on the mystery of God, Jesus Christ, science and religion, the problem of suffering, creation and ecology, Mary and the saints, and issues related to justice for women. Just a few things that she dabbles in here. In addition to hundreds of essays and dozen award-winning books, some of which are available in the back, you can find them. Her accomplishments include serving as president of the Catholic Theological Society of America, the oldest and largest society of theologians in the world, and president of the American Theological Society and Ecumenical Association. But Dr. Johnson's ministry extends beyond research, library work, and the halls of academia. Deeply involved in the life of the church, her service in the church has included being a theologian on the National U.S. Lutheran Catholic Dialogue, a consultant to the U.S. Catholic Bishops' Committee on Women in Church and Society, a theologian on the Vatican-sponsored dialogue between science and religion, a participant in the Vatican-sponsored ecumenical conference on Christ and world religions, and a core committee member of the Common Ground Initiative started by Chicago Cardinal Joseph Bernardin to reconcile polarized groups in the Catholic Church, something we certainly still need very much today. Dr. Johnson is a leading voice of our day, a woman who has embraced the role of leadership in the church as a theologian, one who does the thinking of the church, engaging our rich Catholic tradition with new insights of science and with the new questions that continue to emerge in our world. She is a woman of deep faith, a profound thinker, a brilliant teacher, and truly a sister to all who seek to deepen their understanding of their faith and the life to which it calls them. I'd just like to say something more about her extraordinary impact on our world as a teacher. Anyone who has read her books, listened to her lectures, or had the great privilege of being a student in one of her classes knows that teaching is her passion. Elizabeth has been given virtually every award a theologian can be given, too numerous to mention. But it is telling that the awards she holds most dear are the Fordham University Teaching Award and Fordham's Professor of the Year. It is precisely in her role as teacher and mentor that she has helped countless students to find God, to take hold of their faith and move it into action. Her vocation as a theologian has been lived out in a profound way in her ministry of teaching, of leading others to understanding and action. And tonight you too will experience firsthand her extraordinary gifts as teacher. So I hand over the podium to our distinguished guest. There will be time at the end of her presentation for questions, so we welcome you, Elizabeth.
Thank you very much, Margaret, for that most gracious introduction. And good evening, everyone. And kudos to everyone who came out on such a bad night to come and listen. Some just had to come maybe downstairs, but others of you were out on the road. So I hope that I'm looking forward actually to this evening to have a really good exchange at the end. We're going to be dealing with a question that's under development in theology, which makes it very interesting. It's still underway. So the title of this talk is God's charity broad enough for bears? And I'd like to talk to you this evening about the subject of the earth in a religious framework. And if you are someone who lives by a certain faith, which many here do, I invite you to test out what I say against your own belief. And if you are not someone who lives by faith, I hope you will find it interesting at least to hear what religious folk are saying about the subject these days. So I'd like to start with an intriguing story from which I took the title of this talk, about John Muir, the 19th-century American naturalist. Once when Muir was hiking in the Yosemite wilderness, he came upon a dead bear. And he stopped to reflect on this creature's dignity. Here was an animal with warm blood and a heart that beat like ours, who rejoiced to feel the warm sun on his fur, for whom a good day was finding a bush full of berries. And later, Muir wrote a bitter entry in his journal, criticizing the religious folk he knew, who made no room in their faith for such noble creatures. And he wrote, "They think they are the only ones with souls, the only ones for whom heaven is reserved. But to the contrary, God's charity is broad enough for bears." So is it? What do you think? That's our question tonight, right? Is the God you believe in or seek, is this God madly, passionately in love with bears and with other plants and animals on our planet? Think of the striped bass and the Atlantic sturgeon in the Hudson River, the songbirds and woodpeckers, bald eagles and gulls native to these skies, the local squirrels, beavers, black bears, and porcupines, and the red maple, oak, dogwood, and fir trees of this Hudson Valley. Is God's charity broad enough for them? You see how this is kind of a new question that we're asking now in theology? And far from being a subject of merely abstract interest, this question is shot through with urgency because, as you know, in our day, a new ecological awareness of the world and life is growing among us. It's interesting to trace back. Ecological, that word, or ecology, comes from the Greek word oikos, O-I-K-O-S, which means home. And so, we are realizing in our day that our beautiful blue marble of a planet is home to a marvelous array of life: bacteria, insects, plants, animals, including humans. We're animals in this lineup. And this home, scientists tell us, is shared by more than 8 million species, over 6 million on land and 2 million in the seas. And it is our common home, our only home in the vast universe. Now, this ecological awareness is shot through with paradox, because on the one hand, we stand in wonder at the natural world, its age, its beauty, its evolutionary dynamism. But on the other hand, today, we stand sickened at the damage that human action is wrecking on the life of this planet. Air and land and sea polluted, ice caps melting, species going extinct. All because of human behavior that is rendering our planet, our common home, increasingly unhealthy and unfit for life. It's a matter of great puzzlement why people who believe that the natural world is created by God have not stepped forward more vigorously to defend it. And we do believe that. The Bible begins with the great act of creation. In the beginning, God created everything. And it ends with a vision of the whole earth being renewed, with no more tears or suffering, and all held in the glory of God. The creed that many say on Sunday begins with belief in God, the maker of heaven and earth, and of all things visible and invisible. I mean, we're not hiding this belief, right? And if you go into the Gospels, Jesus taught that not a sparrow falls to the ground that our Heavenly Father doesn't care about. Indeed, Christian theology calls the natural world not nature, but creation. And that's not a scientific word. Creation is a spiritual, theological word that names the world with its animals and plants in their relationship to God, the Creator. And yet survey after survey shows that ecological care does not rank high on the list of most religious people's concerns. As a result, I like to put it this way, many Christians today are like the disciples of Jesus on the last night of his life. While the earth is undergoing its agony, we are curled up in the garden, fast asleep. 3 years ago, 2015, Pope Francis wrote a magnificent letter, encyclical, on this subject. And the subtitle is Care for Our Common Home. It's addressed in the first line, quote, to every person living on this planet. And the title is Laudato Si, which means praise to you. It's taken from the opening lines of the Canticle of St. Francis of Assisi, which begins, praise to you, my Lord, with all your creatures. And people have pointed out in that canticle, Francis of Assisi doesn't praise God for all your creatures or through all your creatures, but with all your creatures. Laudato Si, praise to God with this whole array of life. In my view, this is the most important encyclical ever written in the history of the Catholic Church. The first encyclical on social teaching was Rerum Novarum, 1891. And there have been subsequent ones, excellent, beautiful, powerful letters ever since. But this one, right, it not only analyzes the danger that the ecological crisis poses to all life on the planet, but it also connects this with human misery of poverty and social injustice. You don't go through a line in this encyclical that the two aren't intertwined. And it prescribes hopeful ways forward. So I would urge you, if you haven't read it, or even if you have, it's worth a reread many times over. You can easily get it online, and it's available in all kinds of Amazon and other kinds of booksellers, right? It's a beautiful letter to read. It's written to every person in the world on the planet, so it doesn't read like a heavy theological tome. He's trying to talk to people, right? And its descriptions of the problems we face are powerful. I'll give you one example. Quote, "The earth, our home, is beginning to look more and more like an immense pile of filth, covered with industrial waste, causing ill health to people and other living organisms. And this problem is closely linked to a throwaway culture which affects the poor. End quote. And the solutions the encyclical proposes are just as powerful. And at the center is what the Pope calls a new way of being human that enhances rather than diminishes the life of other creatures. Let me repeat that. A new way of being human that enhances rather than diminishes the life of other creatures. In this new way of being human, Pope Francis writes, we humans would see ourselves primarily not as a separate species, lording it over the others, but as part of what he repeats over and over, as part of one splendid universal community, all loved by God. It's a powerful vision. It's a terribly hard vision to get to. So in this lecture, with the striped bass and the eagles and the maple trees around here in mind, I'd like to explore what this means, a new way of being human that enhances rather than diminishes the life of other creatures. So first, I'll explore, I think this is important, this first step, one major obstacle that prevents us from imagining ourselves that way. Second, I will discuss two main resources that can help us melt away this obstacle. And one of them is science, and one of them is the Bible. And finally, I will present three spiritual practices that can help move us to this new way of being human. Because as the Pope writes in the encyclical, this is nothing less than a conversion that's being required of everyone. And I offer these points not expecting that you will necessarily agree, but with the hope that it will stimulate your own thinking about the meaning of yourself as a human being amid the world that God so loves, which is now under threat, and move you and all of us to take meaningful action for the care for our common home. So first point, the obstacle. For centuries, Western philosophy has taught that human beings stand at the pinnacle of this world with other creatures ranked below us in importance and in value. There is a hierarchy of being, it's called, and we humans are at the top. So think of a pyramid and think of the apex of the pyramid, and that's where we place ourselves. And everything else is ranked in a certain order below us. Greek philosophy, from which we get this idea, divided everything in the world into certain proportions of spirit or matter that they were made up of. And spirit was more important than matter, it was closer to God. So things that have more spirit are more important than things that have less spirit. And so, as it was put in Greek philosophy, and of course in my revered teacher, whom I love, Thomas Aquinas, but he did put it this way, right? At the lowest level is rocks, inanimate matter, things that aren't alive, just pure matter. Above them rank the plants, because they're alive, they have a certain spirit. But above them are the animals, because they have more spirit, they're animated, they have locomotion. And above the animals are the humans, because we have a soul, we have rational mind and free will. And above us are the angels, because they don't even have a body. And above that is God. So as I always paraphrase Aquinas when I'm teaching this to my students, we go from the pebble to the peach to the poodle to the person to the principalities and powers. All under the guidance of God, and I've not yet found a P word for God, so if anyone comes up with one, I'd be glad. Right? But note the hierarchy of value that's being assigned on that principle of spirit is more important than matter. And note too, and I look around this room, and many here know what I'm talking about, the spirituality connected with this philosophy, which the church used in its theology for decades, centuries, right? But the spirituality of this view is shaped by the metaphor of ascent, A-S-C-E-N-T, right? That you need to flee the material world and rise to the spiritual sphere where the light of divinity dwells. You must turn away from your own body and sexuality, from the earth and its pleasures, in order to have communion with God. Does this sound familiar? Note, too, that this philosophy identifies, if you take a gender view of this, men with spirit and women with body, so that men rightly rule and women rightly serve them. It's an inescapable dualism once you follow that kind of philosophy. Men are supposedly more spirit-filled than women. Now, this is men's view of themselves. Well, they said women change through the month. You know, they're more emotional, all this kind of thing. And men have the rationality to lead and so on. So look at the history of the Western world. I mean, this is the way structures publicly. Men are fit for public life. Women are meant to private life for nurturing and so on. Based that they're more material. They're more physical. They're more passionate and emotional. Men are more spiritual and more rational and clear-minded. This is a view, by the way, that still afflicts the Catholic Church. Back to the earth, right? It's so deep. This is what I'm trying to say. This is not a superficial obstacle. It's woven its way into the whole way the narrative of Christianity has been presented. So this view of humans as the pinnacle, coming from Greek philosophy, affecting medieval philosophy, church theology, it took a really vicious turn in the 15th and 16th centuries when the European age of exploration began. Because then thinkers took the story of creation in Genesis 1, where God gives the human couple dominion over everything else, and they gave it an imperialistic interpretation as meaning domination. When human nations began to colonize other continents, therefore, resources in those lands were looked upon as there to be extracted for the superior people who were the Europeans. Plants and animals were mere creatures for human use. And not to be missed is the way elite peoples also applied this mandate to other human beings. White Europeans had the right to dominate and enslave darker and indigenous peoples who had less spirit in them, were more matter. Unfortunately, most Christian European theology of those centuries supported this view. So I find it daunting to realize how deeply this view of human beings as masters and rulers of nature has shaped Christian belief and practice, to say nothing of our own country's lifestyle and business practices. With deep roots in the classical tradition, this view has largely erased creation from religious experience, hasn't it? I mean, it's less important. Opening the door to unbridled exploitation of nature without protest from the church until very recently. Now, in strong language for an encyclical, Laudato Si criticizes this hierarchy of being view with humans at the apex of the pyramid. First, it calls it inadequate, that's a quote, and then it goes on to call it, quote, frankly wrong. That's pretty bold. So everything the church has taught before this is wrong. Okay? And I quote, even if we Christians have at times incorrectly interpreted the scriptures to say this. Nowadays, we must forcefully, and that word is in italics, we must forcefully reject the notion that our being created in God's image and given dominion over the earth justifies domination over God's creatures, end quote. Forcefully, we must reject this. And we are meant then, he goes on to say, to live in mutual relation with other creatures, sharing together in one splendid universal community of creation, embraced by the love of God. So the way I would put it, instead of the pyramid or the triangle with us at the top, think circle. Think circle of life. And we're involved in mutual relations with other living creatures. Now, you might be able to sit here and think about that for a minute and imagine it for a minute, but it is hard to get that all through. And I can testify from experience because we're so trained that way. So how can we climb down from the tip of our triangle and re-envision ourselves as part of this one splendid community of creation? We've lived so long with a sense of our own superiority that doing so can be wrenching. I gave a lecture on this last year, and one man in the audience stood up afterwards. I'll never forget it. He was very upset, and he said, "I've always understood myself to be at the peak of the pyramid, and if that goes away and we become a circle, where am I?" It's very deep if you catch it. At least he caught what the issue is, you know. We have to deconstruct our imagination and reconstruct the architecture of our minds and hearts in order to get there. And my argument here, of course, is doing so is more in accord with the love of God for the world than we have been, and much more needed in terms of ethical practice for the planet. So let's move to the second point then. Two resources, I'm calling them, that can help us make this kind of change. The first is scientific discoveries. Where do all living plants and animals on our common home planet come from? They, along with the planet itself, didn't just pop up. It emerged over unthinkable stretches of time in the developing universe. And I think many of you know what we're calling today the cosmic story or the universe story. That our cosmic history stretches back 13.8 billion years ago to the Big Bang, so powerful that the universe is still expanding. Gravity pulled the original gases together into stars that formed galaxies. And after billions of years, first-generation stars grew old and died in vast explosions that cooked the original hydrogen atoms into heavier elements, carbon, nitrogen, gold, oxygen. We live in what we call the Milky Way galaxy, on one little star off on one of its arms. And our own solar system formed 5 billion years ago out of the debris of old, dying, exploding stars. Gravity drew some of this gas together to form a new star that we call our sun. And some of the material clumped together in chunks too small to ignite, forming the planets, including Earth, third rock from the sun. And as some scientists like to say, our planet is a Goldilocks planet. It's not too close to the sun, it's too hot, too far away being too cold, but it's just right. About 3.5 billion years ago, a marvelous event happened which no one yet understands or can replicate. Our inanimate planet came to life when certain molecules deep in the ocean vents joined in such a way that they could reproduce themselves. It's the definition of life. When Charles Darwin published his book On the Origin of Species in 1859, he shared the discovery that ever since that 3.5 billion years ago event, species have been developing slowly from other species through small changes made over deep eons of time. For example, and this is his example, a mutation may increase the toughness of a bird's bill ever so slightly. If the area's major food source is a hard seed, the tougher bill will result in more nourishment for that bird and more successful egg laying. More birds will be born with tougher bills, and birds with weaker bills will eventually disappear. Nature selects a beneficial characteristic when it shows up and plays it forward. And over eons of time, new species emerge from ancestral parents as a result of this ongoing process of small, successful changes that adapt to changing environments. Another of his examples that never ceases to amaze me is that the hawk and the duck have a common ancestor through this process, because they each sought food in a different way and developed different successful adaptations. Not until the 6th edition of his book did Darwin call this evolution. The first 5 editions, his preferred term was descent with modification. So the scientific stories of cosmic origins and then the evolution of life on our planet make it clear, if you think about it, that on this planet, all living creatures are related historically and genetically. We all come from those original blue-green algae, right? We form together, as some like to say, one great branching tree of life, or a little bush, or whatever image you want to bring. But we all come from creatures that lived before us, including humans, obviously. In pondering this, the British scientist who's also a priest, Arthur Peacock, had a wonderful image, I think. He's speaking about the redness of animal blood. And he said, why is animal blood red? And his answer, of course, is iron. Well, where did this iron come from? And I quote, every atom of iron in our blood would not be there had it not been produced in some galactic explosion billions of years ago and eventually condensed to form the iron in the crust of the earth from which we have emerged. And you can go on with every element that makes up our body this way, which is why some scientists especially like to say that human beings and all creatures on this planet are made of stardust. It's quite literally true. The story of biological evolution, moreover, makes evident that we humans share with all other living creatures a common genetic ancestry. Bacteria, the pine trees, blueberries, horses, the great gray whales, we are all kin in the great community of life. And let me quote to you one last time Charles Darwin, in which he says, what can be more curious than that the hand of a man formed for grasping, the paw of a mole for digging, the leg of a horse, the paddle of the porpoise, and the wing of the bat should all be constructed on the same pattern and should include the same bones in the same relative position? End quote. He goes on to say, in the view of those he was arguing with, of direct creation, that God made each thing separately, we can only say it has so pleased the Creator to construct each animal this way. But if we suppose an ancient progenitor had its limbs arranged this way, then all descendants inherited the pattern. The bones might be enveloped in thick membrane to form a paddle to swim, or thin membrane to form a wing to fly, or they might be lengthened or shortened or separated for some profitable purpose, like fingers. But there will be no tendency to alter the framework. Indeed, we give the same names to these bones in widely different animals. And he concludes, what a grand natural system formed by descent with slight modifications. The deeper you go into science, the more you're going to find this kinship between human beings and other creatures. It's a powerful resource to use to rearrange our philosophy of ourselves, right? Let me end this all too brief look, though, at scientific discovery with a timeline suggested by the scientist Carl Sagan. He figured if the Big Bang took place on January 1st, our solar system formed on September 1st. Life on Earth started on September 25th. And human beings emerged on December 31st at 10 minutes to midnight. Apex of the pyramid where we've put ourselves, you see? Or part of this enormous history of the circle of life on this planet. Let science teach us. That's one resource. Another resource, and by the way, this is a multidisciplinary effort going on now, so I'm just taking now a second resource from the religious sphere, namely the Bible. It's interesting to note that apart from its mention in the opening of Genesis and in Psalm 8, the fact that humans should have dominion over other creatures is not even mentioned. It is not the major way that Scripture sees the world-human relationship. Rather, it does see us forming one community of creation, held in existence by the loving power of God. Some biblical scholars are now saying we have to notice that the Bible has a zoological gaze. A gaze that sees a relationship existing between animals and God directly, without human mediation. From the divine side, so to speak, let's just stay with that for a minute. God creates animals. I'm asking here this question, what does the Bible give us to ponder about the relationship of animals to God? Most of us don't think there's any relationship there at all. So ponder this, right? God creates the animals, blesses them, calls them good, gives them a mandate to increase and multiply, right? Makes a covenant with them at the end of the book of Genesis, at the end of the flood, the Noah story. Feeds them, waters them, finds them suitable homes, delights in them, watches over them, cares about their debts, saves them. You save humans and animals alike, O Lord. Psalm 36, verse 6. And overall, fills them with good things, foremost among them, the breath of life. The intimacy of this relationship comes to expression in a text that expresses God's broad knowledge and deep affection. And I'm quoting here from Psalm 50, quote, "For every wild animal of the forest is mine. The cattle on 1,000 hills are mine. I know all the birds of the air, and all that moves in the field is mine." A sense of intimacy here. Animals respond to this loving kindness in their own unique ways by the workings of their neurological lives. They carry out their vocation to increase and multiply, thus participating in the ongoing work of creation. They cry to God for food and groan to God when it's lacking. They make intelligent use of their habitats. They look to God for truth. They praise divine goodness. Their orientation to God is captured in a telling image. And again, this is Psalm 145. The eyes of all look to you, O Lord, and you give them their food in due season. You open your hand and satisfy the desire of every living thing. Just think of the eyes of all, think of all the eyes that are on this planet, of all the animals, and God's care for them. So the implication even of this one question, the God-animal relationship for human self-understanding, I think comes to stunning expression in the book of Job. Most people know this book as the story of a suffering man deprived of his home, his children, his health, his possessions. And in a debate with his friends that grows ever more acrimonious, he maintains that he has done nothing sinful to deserve this punishment, although they are saying to him, you must have done something. And in anguish, he mounts a lawsuit and challenges God to appear in court to defend the way the world is run, because it's not fair. And then Job's text says, quote, and then the Lord answered Job out of the whirlwind. And the answer is unexpected. It begins with a daunting question. Where were you when I laid the foundations of the world? Where were you when I placed the sea within its limits? Where were you when I made the stars begin to shine? It is magnificent nature poetry. It cascades out. But the voice describes animals who are wild and free. The voice says, do you give food to the lions when they are hungry? Do you know when mountain goats crouch to give birth? Do the wild horses bow to your will? And God said, in all of them I take delight, but they're not for you. They're not created to serve your purpose. And it goes on like this. Besides Laudato Si, if you want to read something else to follow up tonight, read the book of Job, the last 4 chapters. And you'll just see this magnificent response from God to this question of Job, which is startling to notice. There is absolutely no mandate to have dominion over all these things, right? Instead, it is understand that you are part of creation that's bigger than you. Okay? And the prophets, the Psalms, the wisdom texts, they all carry out this point, namely that the human place in the scheme of things is not, first of all, one of supremacy. We are not the center of everything. Creation is not all about us. Rather, the breath of every living thing, every animal, bird, fish, and plant, has the same source as the breath of human beings, namely the creating Spirit of God, which the Creed pronounces to be the Lord and giver of life, all life. If we grasp this simple but radical truth, and this is now what I'm saying as a result of a lot of biblical work, theologically, try to realize this, that as creatures, we human beings have more in common with other living species on this planet than we do that separates us, because we are all creatures sharing in the life breath given by God. And we are all kin, therefore, and with the humility essential to being properly human, then, we can take our place among other beloved creatures in whom the living God is independently interested. Now, in view of Christianity's long acceptance of matter-spirit dualism and its paradigm of domination and its ignoring of most of the biblical texts about creation, Pope Francis in Laudato Si recognizes that he is contributing something new to Catholic teaching by emphasizing this community approach to human identity. He says, and I quote, "We are called to recognize that other living beings have a value of their own in God's eyes. Indeed, and again I'm quoting, in our time, the church does not simply state that other creatures are subordinate to the good of human beings, as if they had no worth in themselves and can be treated as we wish, end quote. Rather, and here's a very radical statement, quote, they have an intrinsic value in God's eyes, independent of their usefulness to us, end quote. And why? Pope Francis writes, because God loves them. Quote, even the fleeting life of the least of these beings is the object of God's love, and in its few seconds of existence, God enfolds it with affection. Someone asked him at an audience afterwards, are you talking about the mayflies? Because they're born and they only live less than a day. They mate, they lay their eggs, and then they die again. They poof, they're here and gone. And he wasn't exactly sure that that's what he was referring to. But he just knew some creatures had very short lives, and they still were held in affection in that short period of time by the love of God who created them. The encyclical goes further than this, though. It calls other species a source of revelation. And in this, it's going back to ancient church teaching, the fathers of the church. I think always of Augustine when he said once in a homily, God gave us two books of revelation. One is Scripture, and the other is nature. And we need to know how to read both of them. See, they're a source of revelation. And Pope Francis writes, quote, each creature, quote, reflects in its own way a ray of God's infinite wisdom and goodness and beauty. You can learn something about the Creator from creatures. Just by being what they are, they give us a hint of what the Creator is like. But there's even more. He calls other creatures a sacramental place where God dwells. They're sacramental. Quote, since the Spirit of life dwells in them, we can encounter God in them. You don't have to go to church to encounter God. Well, we know that anyway. But in nature, in the reality of the created world, when seen as creation, you have a place of encounter with God. Looking forward, Pope Francis writes, the final purpose of other creatures is not to be found in us. Rather, all creatures are moving forward with us toward a common point of arrival, which is God. And that's that biblical view of the end of all of creation, again, wrapped up in God. And to put it in his words, the encyclical ends with this hope, quote, at the end, we will find ourselves face to face with the infinite beauty of God. That's his description of heaven, which I find quite beautiful in itself. At the end, I'll repeat, we will find ourselves face to face with the infinite beauty of God, and each creature, resplendently transfigured, will share with us in unending plenitude. End quote. That's how the encyclical ends. So all of these creatures will be with us in the final glory. And that little question, will I see my dog in heaven? Yet he answers clearly, yes, according to the teaching of this encyclical. We're not, if you want to get concrete, no, you can't imagine it, right? Can't. But there's something, the fundamental notion is God, the Creator, loves the earth that is created and will redeem it. It's the nature of God to do that kind of thing. See? So let the Bible teach us, okay? Along with scientific discoveries, it prompts us to reimagine who we are as a species. It's a radical change. So let me move to the third and final point, which I'm calling practices, okay? Practices, yeah. Making this shift is not easy. It is terribly hard. We need, as Pope Francis writes, a conversion. He goes on in eloquent terms to say the current destruction of life on earth has the character of great sinfulness. It is contradicting the will of the Creator that the world should flourish. And in Christian tradition, moving from sin to a life marked by grace is called a conversion. It's a turning. It's a change of direction, pivoting away from one road and going down another. So, facing the ruination of the ecology of our common home, we need a conversion. And this is not in the encyclical, it's my way of putting it. We need a deep conversion to the earth in the name of the God who created and loves the earth. This is the usual way we talk about conversion. It's usually turn away from the world and be converted to God. But we need to be converted back, okay? Because we have ignored, to great detriment of all of us. Facing ecological ruination, we need this deep conversion. And so we need to live as human beings, as Pope John Paul II put it, and Pope Benedict XV, and now Pope Francis. We need to live out an ecological vocation, calling of the baptized in a love of the earth. So in this last part of the lecture, I'd like to highlight and suggest three among many spiritual practices that can move us toward ecological conversion. And those three, I think some of you here, no doubt, already are practicing, but it's good to ponder what we're doing here. Contemplation would be one, asceticism would be a second, and action on behalf of justice would be the third. So first, contemplation. Here, we gaze on the earth with eyes of love and wonder, rather than with arrogant eyes or a utilitarian stare. The 19th-century scientist Louis Agassiz put it this way, and it's a great line. He said, "I spent the summer traveling. I got halfway across my backyard." How he was seeing, which we just usually whiz around, you know. Quieting our minds in contemplation, we really look and learn to appreciate nature's astonishments and therefore be alert to its harm. And anyone who has ever had a sense of God through contact with the natural world knows what this means. In engaging this practice, we can follow the example of Jesus. And Pope Francis holds this up in Laudato Si in the phrase, the gaze of Jesus. He asks us to ponder, how did Jesus look on the natural world? And then he talks about, look at the parables. Jesus used seeds and growing vines and trees and sunsets and foxes and sheep and nesting birds and mother hens and on and on. All creatures of God with something to tell us. And he did not hesitate to declare divine concern for one little dead bird. Quote from Matthew 10, "Are not 2 sparrows sold for a penny? Yet not one of them will fall to the ground without your heavenly Father knowing it." Luke's version, I always am interested in, starts out, "Are not 5 sparrows sold for 2 pennies?" So if you place the double order, it looks like you got a freebie, you know. "Yet not one of them falls that is forgotten by God." Luke 12. So I ask myself this, how do I look upon a dead bird? With the gaze of Jesus? It strikes me when I see roadkill as I drive. What about this dead animal? What does the gaze of Jesus teach me? How to contemplate that, right? The silent, prayerful practice of contemplation has a strong emotional dimension, okay? It helps us, in the beautiful words of Albert Einstein, helps us, quote, to free ourselves from our egocentric prison by widening the circle of our compassion to embrace all living creatures and the whole of nature in its beauty. end quote, from Einstein. That's what contemplation does. So in the depths of our being, contemplation helps us recover a capacity for communion with the natural world, to the point where brother sun and sister moon, brother wolf and little sister bird are more than poetic ways of speaking, but felt truths as they are or were for St. Francis of Assisi. So contemplation. Second practice could be suggested here. Ascetic practice, or penance and sacrifice. Now here you have to tread carefully, because in the tradition that we inherited of dualism, sacrifice always meant sacrifice the flesh, your body, your pleasures, in order to move toward the spirit, right? What we're talking here is changing selfish practices of consumerism, waste, and greed in order to protect life on earth. We make decisions to green up our lives, knowing that how we eat, how we shop, how we travel affects the life of other creatures. We fast, I say this sometimes to my students during Lent, we fast not from candy, but from buying that extra t-shirt. You know, how many t-shirts do you really need in your closet, right? Those who are in business conduct business with an eye to a bottom line that's green and not only red or black, right? Many people today are talking about the asceticism involved in observing the Sabbath as a genuine day of rest. Institutions, too, can engage in ascetic, earth-affirming practices. So colleges and offices and churches can adopt best practices to conserve energy when heating and cooling their buildings, or watering and fertilizing their land, or cleaning their facilities using non-toxic products. So in trying to live more simply and ecologically more healthy, we make sacrifices. I mean, some of this is not convenient. But we make these sacrifices not because we are anti-body, but in order to free ourselves from enslavement to consumer practices that harm other living creatures, and so that we can become life givers, the kinds of humans whose lives enhance rather than destroy the lives of others. And third, action on behalf of justice. Contemplation deepens human connection with the world, and asceticism awakens us to how our actions may harm the world and leads us to change. Both of those spiritual practices have strong long-term practical effects. And so we act. We join with others to speak boldly, to act up critically on behalf of the survival of the planet. There are tough political and economic issues at stake. Decisions about allowable business practices, budget expenditures, energy production, pollution controls, investment policies, trade patterns, climate treaties, and the like, where the well-being of the earth is at stake and where political will needs to be gathered together to make rules that change the way humans act. In the tradition of the biblical prophets and in the spirit of Jesus, people can band together and take critical public stances for the care and protection of the earth, fully aware that if they do, they may well elicit the classical reaction to the prophets and be despised. One can also vote for candidates that stand foursquare for ecological well-being. Okay? Along these lines, Laudato Si carefully lays out the deep-seated connection between ecological devastation and social injustice, saying over and over again that poor people suffer disproportionately from environmental damage. One example that I use from my own area The 15th Congressional District of the South Bronx is the poorest congressional district in the United States. And here are cited numerous sewage treatment plants for the city, waste transfer stations, and product distribution hubs serviced every day by hundreds of polluting trucks. Public health statistics show that this area has the highest concentration of cases of child asthma in New York City. Overlay these two facts, they are not incidental. Political advocacy works for a healthy planet for all living people, with social justice and ecojustice, as we say, intertwined, with an eye especially on the poor. So to conclude, we started with the story of Muir and his bear, which raised the question of why, unlike the God they say they believe in, religious people in general do not love and protect other creatures. Drawing on Laudato Si, we tackled a central stumbling block to this love, the idea that humans have the right to dominate others, and taking ourselves off the apex of the pyramid and placing ourselves into the circle of life as kin to all other species is a huge step that both science and religion can support, and we ended with some practices that might help us take those steps. I'll conclude by quoting the scientist Stephen Jay Gould, who once said about the earth, he said, "We will not fight to save what we do not love." Is God's charity broad enough for bears? If we say yes, and I hope by now we're saying yes, okay, then our own charity can grow to be like God's, whose love embraces the whole groaning, evolving earth, now under terrible duress. The task is daunting. We haven't a moment to lose. But we say we love God, and God loves us and the whole earth, and that's the direction we need to be moving. Thank you. Thank you. Okay. So, thank you. I hope this has triggered in your own mind some thoughts or some characteristic objections or something you would want to add or a question. As I said, this is now, it's a hot area in theology. A lot of books, a lot of dissertations, a lot of courses, new and ideas, because we haven't gone down this road before. It's, if you want to go back to the Second Vatican Council, it's sort of a sign of the times. And it calls faith then to get connected in its own way. So, what's on your noble minds? Observations, questions? Yes? Yeah, and many, did you all hear what she said? Yeah. That we can't, when she taught 7th grade science, there was a dilemma because we can't look to the animals as models for how we should live because many animals eat their young when they're weak. We're supposed to say they eat each other. In other words, this becomes a bigger issue of predation, you know, and the question of animals going after each other. I don't know about you, but when I watch PBS nature programs, you know, and the lion starts after the little baby gazelle, and I'm going, I can't look, you know. So but it's the way of nature. So we're not saying in that regard that they are models to us, you know. It's when I was saying they are a source of revelation. It's it's more looking at the positive ways that they have of being themselves in the world. But even that eating of the young, there are many scientists who ponder this because it strikes your heart if you're a compassionate person, the way this happens, right? That to take the pelicans as an example, there's one breed of pelican gives birth to, the mother lays 2 eggs several days apart. The first egg hatches, and it's a good, healthy little chick. The second egg hatches, and the parents do not feed it, or they feed it only lightly. And eventually, the older chick gets the younger one kicked out of the nest, where it cries and is pitiful when you see this on TV, and it becomes food for the gulls. And that's millions of pelicans do this, right? And the second chick is born as insurance. If something happens to the first chick, they still have another baby in that round of reproduction, and so they have a successful breeding season. But that doesn't take away the pain of that other little chick that's going. It's not a model for humans, but scientists say, where's the wisdom there? It's an evolutionary wisdom that has developed, that has enabled that species to survive for what they think is 35 million years. It's a successful evolutionary strategy. So there's a wisdom built into the bodies of the female pelicans as to how to get their offspring to continue. I'll tell you what I've done with that. I mean, I quote that pelican chick story in my book, Ask the Beast, and I've been at conferences where everybody's wrestling with this. The notion that Christ is with that pelican chick in the suffering and death of that little one. As we say, Christ who died in suffering on the cross knows what we suffer, also knows what that chick is suffering. It's an extension of redemption out to include the whole animal kingdom. And it's people who are arguing this, myself included at this point, talk about the incarnation. If I can just go for 1 minute into this point, in John's Gospel it says, and the Word was made flesh and dwelt among us, right? It didn't say the Word became human. Because in the Bible, flesh is a broader reality and is applied also to the animals and the plants, all flesh, and dwelt among us. And so the incarnation of Jesus in the flesh brings the Word of God into correlation with all historical beings who suffer and die. And so the crucified Christ is with that chick as only God can be, namely with the promise of something more. It's a way religiously of trying to reflect on that. It extends redemption, as it does, in fact, in the Bible. So it's not a simplistic thing. Thank you for raising that. That's always a huge issue when we get into that. They're not our models in that regard. But the suffering that goes on there does raise to us another kind of question. Yeah. Talk about vegetarianism and veganism. All I can say is it would be better for the earth if we all went that way in our diets, right? For obvious reasons. When you look at the cruelty of factory farming, as it's called, and the way chickens and hogs and cattle are kept and so on, to feed our voracious appetite, there's a cruelty there that we should not have to, that we should be able to wean ourselves from, right? Hopefully. But the problem is this. I said before, predation. As evolutionary beings, we eat others. That is what nature does. And especially children or growing bodies or those who are weaker, you need protein. So to eat meat is not, there's a big debate here. Did Jesus eat meat? And people say he ate the Passover, it was a lamb. And they said, no, he ate fish, he was by the Sea of Galilee, So I said, whatever he ate, it's not going to settle the question for us. The question is ethically, how do you make that kind of decision? So it's an ethical diet for a small planet, all these kinds of books that are out now, ways of going to plant-based diets rather than vegetable, rather than animal diets. First of all, it's healthier for the adult body, less cholesterol, et cetera, but also it's better for the planet. So the more we can wean ourselves away in that direction, the better. But being realistic, there are many opportunities and times when you need to have some meat, but it doesn't have to be, steak every day. In other words, it's a value to be worked toward. Yeah. Well, at least at the minimum, I could say that definitely. Religiously as well. There's another asceticism practice. Yeah. Yes.
I just want to comment on being a vegan or a vegetarian. I'm not either one.
Speak up a little louder. Okay.
I'm not a vegan or a vegetarian, but a few years ago I read in Sierra Club magazine that for a person, if you're a vegan, or a vegetarian, you need 2 acres of land to sustain you in terms of food. But if you're a meat eater, it takes 9 acres for you to be sustained with what the animals have to eat. So I've never really enjoyed the idea of being a vegan or a vegetarian, but it is unsustainable for the earth and the populations that we have for us to really be eating meat every day. And I kind of think about, Fridays when we give up meat, that maybe take a day or 2 days during the week and not eat meat, just for the sustainability of the planet.
Thank you. Thanks for that. Very good. Please.
I noticed in your talk that you didn't use the word stewardship of creation, which many authors seem to use as a substitute for dominion over the earth or creation. And I was wondering, was that deliberate on your part? Do you see something negative in the term stewardship?
It was very deliberate. And there's a great debate going on, in religious circles and theology of all kinds. As compared to dominating creatures and exploiting them and thinking they're only there for our use, stewardship is a fabulous step forward. But in light of both the science and the religious view of creation that I was presenting tonight, it doesn't go far enough. Because it puts the care for creation on the side of humans, which it rightly does, and ignores the mutual response. It doesn't, in other words, it's a hierarchical model still, only we're supposed to behave better as the apex of the pyramid, which some will, but many will not, especially if there's profit to be made. So to change the paradigm into a community paradigm it's more radical to do that. It's a tendency. So I do not join with those who criticize stewardship unmercifully. We still think we're the king of the world kind of thing. But I do see that it doesn't go far enough in giving us a sense of kinship with all the animals and the plants, and that we are only part of creation, certainly a special part. When people say, oh, humans and all of the species, we're all just the same, I would say, are you crazy? Like, what species is ruining the earth right now? It's not the pelicans. It's us. No, we have the power, the ability, our minds, our wills, and so on. So to turn that in a caring direction, that's what stewardship does. But it doesn't go far enough in reimagining a more mutual kind of relationship. But thank you for that. That's a great question. Yeah, and it's a very disputed point right now in the field. Yeah. Yeah.
A question about the title. is God's charity broad enough for bears? In mentioning that this is really hot and really new, part of me definitely sees that because it barely registers, in terms of our discussion of faith and spirituality. But part of me also recognizes that the idea of kinship for, like, St. Francis has been around a long time, or in indigenous spiritualities. So I guess I'm wondering if you could say a little bit more in terms of how this is new, because part of it seems like it's not new.
Yeah, and to add to your examples, which are very good examples, Francis of Assisi and indigenous peoples, let me add two others. Celtic spirituality was very in tune with nature and other creatures. And the fourth example, Orthodox Christianity, Eastern Christianity, never went this route that the West took over. It's interesting to figure out why, because it is Greek philosophy that gave us this idea. But as it came into theology, it was the West that really set up this hierarchy of being. And Orthodox theology, if you go to the Eastern churches at all, Russian Orthodox, Greek Orthodox, the icons that they always have nature in there, the desert or the tree or a bird, with the saint or with Christ or with Mary. They've never ignored it the way we have. So it certainly is there. In other words, we're wealthy in resources if we wanted to open up the door and see what's there, right? But when I say it's new, I'm talking about the Western tradition, the Roman tradition, the medieval European, Thomas Aquinas, etc. tradition that gave us, if you will, the Baltimore Catechism, the Roman Catholic Church of the West. And even though Francis of Assisi and the Celtic saints are in that church, they're a stream of tradition, but they didn't affect the broad spectrum. And as you so well said, as you started to speak, that most people haven't heard of this. Just to challenge, when's the last time you heard a homily about this? It's not in our language. It's not the way, this is important, it's not the way we tell the narrative of Christianity. It's all about Adam and Eve, and they sinned, and Christ came, and we're saved. I mean, that's the standard way of doing it. And earth and all its creatures don't even factor in. And we'll say God created them in the beginning, but, that's over. It doesn't matter. So when I say it's new, we're taking a tradition of a good 1,500 years and saying, of course, it proclaimed the Word of God in many beautiful ways, but it was really lacking in attention to this. It really missed this. And it's time, given the way the earth is being treated now, that we need to recover that. And I think what I was doing when I went into the Bible today was saying, we have the resources. We don't have to invent the wheel all over again. But what we have to do is reread it and rethink it and tell the narrative of Christian story more fully than what we've done. But thank you again. That's great. One more, okay?
Worry about how things are going.
Start again.
I said the aspect of responsibility. I think we have to see ourselves in that role, because since we have an intellect, we should be able to draw some conclusions that would benefit the earth and choose to live accordingly. We're certainly not going to be, what I had said before was, it's not going to be up to the pelican to figure it out. Mm-hmm. It's our responsibility.
Because we are the ones who are acting in such a way that we're depleting the life of others on the earth, and ultimately our own. Yeah, our own practices are what's doing it. And when you think of how this is so tied into our economy, we didn't get into that much tonight, but it's a huge, huge problem of who's profiting by gas and oil extraction, et cetera, et cetera. It's just huge. But we, as religious people, and I think that was mainly the main point tonight, who aim to love God and love our neighbor as ourselves. Who is our neighbor? Can we open that definition to be more than the man beat up by the side of the road, the person in need, to include the species that are being put out of existence as our neighbor, as kin, and so on. And so we bring it out. It's a religious matter. It's not just ethics. It's not just moral. It is. But it goes deep down into who do you believe God is. And that's why I entitled this, Is the God you love, is that God's love broad enough for bears? And if so, then where are you in that love? That was the point. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you, Elizabeth. Another quote of John Muir that I came across was, "Into the forest I go to lose my mind and to find my soul." But tonight, I think the metaphor tonight is, we went with Elizabeth tonight, and she blew our minds, and we found our souls. So I think, this was a great gift, this notion of our faith and our spirituality really leading to action. I mean, you gave us many possibilities of where we might start, and I think for many of us it's to read Laudato Si, go back to it, really ponder it, maybe in the book of Job. It sounds like something to do. And to hear again what you said, we are going to be posting this on YouTube. We'll put it out there, so you'll be able to listen to this presentation again, maybe many times, because it was so rich and so wonderful. Earlier this month, James Keenan, a Jesuit, wrote a commentary in National Catholic Reporter, and he said, if we want to reform the church, let's make women cardinals. And because you don't have to be ordained to be a cardinal. And women. His argument is women could provide really our church with the kind of grace-filled leadership and wisdom we need today in our church. And he mentioned Elizabeth Johnson. So who knows? I mean, she has my vote. It sounds like you have many votes here, many votes. So, pardon me? Yeah. Well, maybe we will someday. We'll have a vote. As you leave, we have books on sale in the back, and many books, and they're wonderful, and different topics and different approaches. So I do invite you to take a good look and see. And Elizabeth is willing to sign your book up here if you want to get a book and then bring it up here to be signed. And just to let you know that we'll be welcoming Joseph Cardinal Tobin from the Newark Archdiocese for our spring Dr. Lou lecture. He's still choosing the date, so we will let you know with announcements. So watch for announcements about that program on our Facebook page and your parish bulletins. And if you've given your contact information when you registered online, we have it. We will email you about that. Okay, so there is a basket in the back for any free will donations if you'd like to make one to help cover this cost. But we are delighted that you are here. We are thrilled that you've come, and we're happy to be able to share our home with you. And we wish you safe travel home. Be safe on your journey home. Thank you again.